Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you have enjoyed the short break here with us. And now it is my true pleasure to introduce to you our next keynote speaker. He may be new to some of you, but to some of us, he's an old timer, I would say, even though we've invited him here today actually to represent youth and to be one of the youth leaders of not just the world and in his position, but actually also just recently joined the Prime board. So please help me welcome Abdullahi Alim. You are, Abdullah, an award-winning community organizer leading the Davos Lab at the World Economic Forum in your daily professional role. You are also a policy and impact aggregator for nations seeking to rebuild post-pandemic systems with young people and the unborn generations in mind. The Davos Lab is the world's first youth recovery effort premised on the views, ideas, and concerns of 2 million young people from around the world. And I'm proud to say that you've just today actually joined the first Prime board meeting in your new capacity as Prime board member. And we have high aspirations for you to bring in that youth voice on the board and also more generally. So please take it on from here. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mette, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever this call finds you. I specifically say good morning from where I am, where it's a 2 a.m. cold, but could be much chillier kind of morning here in Australia. My name is Abdullahi Alim, and I've led for the last 2 years an initiative called the Davos Lab at the World Economic Forum. The Davos Lab is really the world's first recovery effort with the intent of trying to safeguard the lives and livelihoods of future generations. When we say future generations, sometimes people might misinterpret that as meaning young people, future generations in the descriptive sense. But I mean that in the literal sense. I want us to think about how do we protect the lives and interests of the children who are yet to be born, the children that will be born after this pandemic, who will be coming into a world where we've just experienced the worst economic downturn of the last century. We'll be coming into a world where they are also experiencing the largest sort of reckoning around social justice in our particular generation, and who are coming into a world where the climate crisis is becoming more and more of a nightmare, but also more and more of a reality on our day-to-day lives. And so more critically, for the last 2 years, and especially during the height of the pandemic, when most of us were stuck in our isolations and lockdowns, I've been thinking about what it means to be a good ancestor, what it means to really part a legacy to the generations that will come after us in ways that they will look back to us in gratitude and in thanks for the services that we've created. My best attempt at doing that was to mobilize a group of 25 young people around the world behind an initiative called the Davos Lab. Basically, in a nutshell, what we did is we surveyed and held dialogues with as many young people around the world as possible. These dialogues ranged from all sorts of and all corners of the world. We had young people who were working in the informal sector in small rural towns in different African countries, for example. We had young people who were brave enough to take part in these conversations living as undocumented migrants in countries in this world which are particularly hostile to migrants. We had young people in Wuhan. We had young people living in really at the core of the Amazonian nations in Brazil as well. Anywhere and everywhere you can imagine, we probably tried as best as we can to reach young people in those areas and to get their perspectives in what this future world should look like. Ultimately, we gathered the perspectives of about 2.3 million young people. And we wanted to get this grassroots momentum, grassroots energy reflected in the world's first recovery plan. And it gave me great joy to see that recovery plan come to life in August of last year. The parting message that I shared to our community, who were really the force behind this initiative, was two main ideas. One, in this moment where we are transitioning and reimagining and redefining, one, nothing is off the table. Really, any and every idea at this moment is worth consideration. But at the same time, nothing is guaranteed. Two extremes Nothing is off the table, nothing is guaranteed. And it's this world, to be honest, that we find ourselves in at the moment, meaning we've got a small, narrow opportunity, but we shouldn't just rest on this opportunity. We need to take every advantage possible to make sure we take this as our chance as young people to part a legacy for future generations of young people, so that they can inherit a world which is far more equitable. And in those reflections, in those thoughts that I had as soon as the report launched in August of last year, and as soon as we tried to convince as many governments as possible to take note of our policy decisions, I had to go back to 2008. Because 2008 felt very similar to 2020. 2008, of course, played host to what was then the largest financial crisis of the last 100 years. And in many ways, in 2008, we did the best that we could. We ran on good intentions. We used the language of change. We said we would change things. But in all honesty, the world has actually only gotten worse since that moment. Again, economic inequality has become far more rampant in today's systems. The climate crisis, now getting the attention that it deserves for many, many years of the last decade and a bit, really failed to get much of the attention of policymakers and businesses to the degree that it warranted. And for that reason, and for that reason alone, I have to start thinking more critically about what happened in 2008 and 2020. And when I look specifically at 2008, I think of why it is that we had such a large reckoning with our financial systems, with economic injustice, and why it is that nothing happened thereafter. What we did see, however, unfortunately, was rising economic anxiety. We saw the Arab Spring. We saw Occupy Wall Street. And in many ways, the rise of far-right nationalism across the Northern Hemisphere, whether it's in Europe or North America, a lot of that is still attributed to the 2008 financial crisis. However, on today's call, I actually want to go one step further. Dare I suggest the thought that this might actually have something to do with the ideas that some of those business executives were exposed to when they were young students, budding minds in business schools around the world. In that kind of search and questioning, I began to go deeper into what are some of the ideas prevalent and steeped into the logic of business schools around the world. I had to even go back into my own experience as a business school graduate and how I had to pair that against my own sort of experience personally. And there are just some troubling facts which I think we really, really need to unpack on today's call. And I think it's a call to action, especially for young students, especially for young alumni, and especially for those who are trying to create equity in the wider world. When we think systemically, so this is thinking about the core cultural and political factor that upholds inequality, we have to go back to really the root of the problem. And we have to go back to where we have our opportunity to create change. At the core of it, we have a few issues. The first one is neoliberal thinking, neoliberal economics in particular, is steeped into the curricula, especially of economics and finance programs in business schools around the world. It prioritizes lower taxation without regard for externalities. It pushes this notion that profit maximization is the sole responsibility of corporate executives. It's the fiduciary responsibility of corporate executives, when in actual fact, in many parts of the world, that's actually just not true. And it also pushes this idea that business students need to replicate the culture and politics of the business world. What does that last bit mean? There was a research study to look into the ways in which business schools students think and act. And one of the things that they found, which was quite interesting, is that when you look at the business school curricula, it's made significant strides. But at the end of the day, it's still just reflecting the culture in elite business. That is, they promote social liberalism. So you will see case studies in many business schools around the world that support, for example, women leadership, that support minority leadership in business schools around the world. All incredible feats. But you'll see very, very limited examples that cut across class lines. So even though we have just come out of the peak of this pandemic, hopefully, you will still see very little discussions around labor unions, unsafe labor practices, wage declines, which are really at the core of the economic anxiety that we are observing in youth-led movements around the world. In 2019, for example, just before this pandemic really kicked off, the Washington Post called 2019 the year of the protest. We saw that in Europe, we saw that in Latin America. It didn't get as much attention. We saw that as much, we also saw that as much in sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of those movements, a lot of those youth-led movements were really speaking to economic anxiety. So my ask is really to say, for us to be good ancestors, we have to look critically at the ways in which businesses and governments of today lead. But more critically, we have to understand that the opportunity to create change and the opportunity to uphold problems is uniquely held in big business in today's world. And that's just a fact. And for us to really have a parting legacy, to change the thinking, to change the culture, to change the politics of big businesses around the world, we really also need to change the business culture, the political culture of business schools at the very same time too. We also need to recognize and take stock of a conversation I was having with a panelist earlier, the contentious T word, a word we don't really talk as much when it comes to business schools, and that's taxation. Taxation or taxation avoidance is really at the core of the collapse of social systems for the most part over the last 10, 15 years. We would not have had the very weak public health systems in different parts of the world, in some cases that weren't able to even withstand the COVID pandemic, if we hadn't had to cut social programs, public health programs, while at the same time neglecting the responsibility to collect those taxation from businesses around the world too. Really, what I'm trying to say here is that businesses exist as organisms, and they exist actually in a political economy. The actions that a business takes today, especially when it's a big business with a large footprint, has consequences on the environment, has consequences on the livelihoods of those in which that business practices. And it also has consequences for society at large too. So I really want to put a call to action to as many young people on this call in particular too. If we want to take this legacy to create change seriously, we have to look at what other young people before us were chanting and really protesting about. A lot of the movements, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, were really about economic anxiety on the part of young people, on the part of poor people around the world. For us to really take this idea seriously, for us to take this notion of stakeholder capitalism seriously, for us to really usher this vision of corporate social justice, seeing businesses as entities for real social justice and social progress, we have a whole host of things that we need to do. But the most immediate thing that we can do as young people today, especially as students and recent graduates, is to really ask ourselves, what are some of the ideas exclusively that we are being exposed to at business schools? It's just not right. It's just not fair that in today's world, we could have a case study, for example, in corporate finance that advances a particular option that, let's say, maximizes tax obligations on a business, but at the same time, it's only social science students in other part of the university that are then analyzing the costs and consequences of those social anxieties as they begin to emerge 10, 20 years down the track. We need to take a comprehensive approach, especially in the very connected world that we have now. And that means taking a core look at the kind of economics, this Friedman style of economics that is still steeping its way into business schools around the world. At the same time, we also need to have a conversation about the private sector.
Abdullah, I think you are muted. That's it.
Oh.
Yes, that's it. But only for the last 30 seconds, please.
Okay, perfect. You frightened me. I was like, oh God, was I muted for the last 15? Fantastic. Well, just to sort of maybe even summarize at this stage, it really just comes down to us thinking, what is the ways in which we could be good ancestors? Being a good ancestor means you need to look forward as much as you need to look back. When I look back, I don't look back just at the 2020 downturn. I look at 2008 as well. I think of the fact that we used the language of change, but didn't necessarily go as far as we should. This time we have an opportunity yet again to really create structural change. And in support of us is a whole generation amongst us of teenage activists who protested in support of the climate, of young people across the world who supported calls for racial justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is the next pipeline of talent entering business schools across the world. And it's our responsibility to make sure this justice agenda, this idea of creating stakeholder capitalism that works for as many people as possible, is really a champion in our business schools as well. And so I really do want to encourage as many young people as possible to take this conversation to the college campuses as much as we can, because social justice is intimately linked to businesses. Businesses are intimately linked to business schools. Thank you very much.